Hey, it's me. How are you, friends? Always a pleasure to have you joining us here on the Paul Leslie Hour. It's a very special episode this time around. We have a very special in-studio guest, David Becker, one of the most distinctive artists in the world of jazz. He is a guitarist, international performer, recording artist, producer, and music teacher. David, it's a great pleasure to have you here. Thank you so much for making the trip.
It's my pleasure, Paul.
It's an honor.
Well, thank you.
And in addition to doing the interview, we are going to have a bonus. You're going to be playing some songs for us.
I am, yes. I brought my guitar, and I'll do a little bit of playing,
So there's a song of yours. It's called Brad's Blues.
Right. This is a new tune that's on an album that just came out with guitarist Brad Rebuchin, who used to play with Ray Charles. He's an old friend of mine. We did a record called For John, which is dedicated to John Abercrombie. And this is a tune I wrote for Brad, and it's called Brad's Blues.
All right. Let's hear it. Sounding good, David.
Thank you.
So tell us a bit about this record.
Well, this record is one that's been in the works for probably 35 years. I've known Brad Rebuchin since I was in my early 20s when I started the David Becker Tribune with my brother in L.A. And Brad was always another guitar player in the Valley, in the San Fernando Valley of Los Angeles, that was playing jazz. And we were not competitors, but we were sort of supporters of each other. He actually showed up to the very first DBT gig. And we would play together whenever we had the chance. And then over the years, as my career grew, Brad became a sideman for Ray Charles and some other people. And he would always say, yeah, we should do a record together. And I said, yeah, we should, because every time we played, there was a nice synergy happening. And so just about 2 years ago, we were playing at a NAMM show in Los Angeles. And Brad said, we should definitely do a record. And I said, yeah, I'm going to put it on my calendar. So we got in the studio last July and recorded about 4 hours. I had written a song for John Abercrombie when he passed away. I was in Italy the day he passed away, and I was doing a concert, so I wrote this tune called For John, because I'd worked with John on the record, the Attila Zoller tribute record, where Pat Metheny's on it and Jim Hall and a bunch of other people. And John and I were going to play together. We were going to do some concerts, and sadly he passed away. So it made me reflect on John. And John was a big influence not only on me, but also Brad, because not just the way he played, but the way he played in a duo, his sensibility and things like that. And so we recorded that tune. We did one of John's tunes called Ralph's Piano Waltz, and then we did some improvising, which came out really nicely. I mean, we used titles that were based on some of John Abercrombie's either sense of humor or his nickname, for instance, when he was in Dreams was Crumbles. That's what Randy Brecker called him. So we have a tune called Crumbles, and then we've got a tune that's called, as a matter of fact, we were trying to make money, and that story is that when I was a kid, my brother Bruce got this record, Timeless, which was John's first record. And the way he was exposed to it, his drum teacher, Freddie Gruber, who's the famous drum teacher who taught a whole bunch of people, Dave Weckl and Steve Smith, as well as my brother. My brother was kind of ranting and raving, I want to play with my brother and we want to make money and all this stuff. And Freddie blopped the needle down on the first track, which is a tune called Lungs, which is this really up-tempo, frenetic tune with Jan Hammer and Jack DeJohnette, and said, you think these guys are trying to make money? So years later, we were at a jazz festival in Latvia, and I know John, and John was there, and Adam Nussbaum was there, and so we're hanging with Adam, and Bruce knows Adam. And so Bruce told him that story. And John had just flown in from somewhere, and we'd been at the festival for a couple of days. He looked pretty burnt out. And he just looked at Bruce and said, well, because he said, I told him that story, I think these guys are trying to make money. And he said, as a matter of fact, we were trying to make money. And so that just kind of tied the whole thing together. But I'm very happy with the record. And Brad and I also were able to get John's widow, Lisa, involved to the point where she's very excited about the record and is very supportive of it. So, and we just actually got submitted for a Grammy nomination, so I hope that we get some votes out there. So,
congratulations. What are your recollections of John Abercrombie?
John was a very funny fellow, and he was a great guitar player. He just had a very interesting, dry sense of humor. And I was very fortunate to meet him kind of happenstancely when I was a kid in L.A. He was playing with his quartet, and I had seen him with Ralph Towner doing a duo when I was a student at GIT, because GIT, when I was a student, I was there back in 1980 or 81, and they had guys every month or every other week, it seemed like, Steve Morse and Abercrombie and Towner, and, Steve Lukather came. He was just, in Toto. They had their first record out. So when John came to the school, I don't think I spoke to him, but I actually went and saw him play, and I went up and I, got the courage and said, hi, John, big fan, a couple of your records and stuff like that. And he was really nice, and he said, here's my number, if I'm, next time I'm in town, or call me or whatever. So we sort of got to know each other a little bit, and then as my career started to grow, making records and touring, we ran into each other occasionally. Or I'd call him up, if I was in New York or something. And then in 2004, I think it was, or 3, I was living in Germany, and I was touring a lot in Germany, and John happened to be over there. So we saw each other again, and we had a chance to play. So we sat down and played together, and it was nice. And John said, wow, this sounds great. We should do something together. And I said, yeah, I would love to. So, time went on, and we ended up playing for a Joe DiOrio memorial concert for Joe's birthday in New York at Birdland, along with Pat Martino. And again, the idea came up. So then when this record that I produced of Attila Zoller's music came to be, I thought of John right away, because John knew Attila and was a big fan. And so I said, hey, do you want to do a tune on the Attila record? And he said, absolutely. So it's funny, because on that tune I didn't play with John. Bruce played drums, and Michael Formanak played bass. But I played the very last chord because there was a fade out and there was a chord missing. So I went in the studio and just plopped this chord down, which you can hear at the very end. But it was fun working with John because, first of all, he wanted to do about 50 takes of the song. And we had limited time in the studio, but I just let him do it because I thought, and he just was a great human being. I mean, you could call him up anytime, and he always made time for you. And I think he was probably one of the biggest influences on a lot of guitar players that didn't realize it, because, he came out of that Berkeley school and the Mick Goodrick kind of generation, John Scofield as well. But John had a really great career recording because he did all of his records on ECM, and he got along very well with Manfred Eicher. In fact, I just ran into Manfred in Munich in the lounge, Lufthansa lounge, and I've never met him. I knew a guy years ago from ECM, but I introduced myself and said, I was a friend of John's and blah, blah, blah. Oh, where are you on tour? And he was asking me these things. I didn't tell him about the CD because I didn't know we were going to have it in production at that point, but I may give Manfred a copy at some point. So.
Already you've mentioned a lot of guitar players: Jim Hall, Pat Martino, Pat Metheny, John Scofield. I would be curious to know the guitarists that have had the biggest influence on you.
The biggest influence on me would have to be, as far as just getting my head straight of what I need to do for myself, was Joe DiOrio, because Joe was kind of my mentor when I was at GIT. And Joe and I did a record together back in 2005, which I always wanted to do, The Color of Sound. And that's probably some of the best playing that he and I have ever done. And Joe would tell you that as well. Sadly, Joe had a stroke right after that, so his career kind of, took a back seat. But he recovered. He still is teaching and still has a big influence on me. But as far as guitar players that I listened to as a kid, in the jazz genre, it started with Grant Green and Wes Montgomery and John Abercrombie, because I heard that record at 16. I was aware of guys like Lee Ritenour and Larry Carlton, but I wasn't a big fan of their music. Not that there's anything wrong with it. It just didn't touch me the way that some of the other music did. I love Larry's playing, and we became label mates later on at MCA. And Lee, I've talked to a few times, and but I'd have to say that when I was at GIT, I was listening to Joe play because he was there, and then Wes Montgomery because Joe knew Wes. And then I was also a fan of Scofield and Metheny, and that was early in their careers. I think Pat Metheny only had like 3 records or something, 2 or 3 records, and Scofield had 1 or 2. And they were the younger guys that I knew had a connection to Wes and Jim Hall. And there's Joe DiOrio, who knew Wes Montgomery, and Wes was a huge fan. And then, I was listening to Wes. So I got a good hybrid of, the older guy, the living guy, and the younger guys. And then, of course, horn players were a big influence. Miles Davis and John Coltrane and Charlie Parker, Sonny Rollins. Trumpet players too, because I played trumpet before I played guitar. So I had a Dizzy Gillespie record when I was like 12, with Mickey Roker and Milt Jackson, and I got to see those guys play. I remember going to a club in L.A., and I was like, 4 feet from Milt Jackson, and I was the only white kid there. But that was a great experience. So those, I'd have to say those guitar players, plus Jack Wilkins, New York guy that I got to know later on as well, and pretty much everybody that was on the radar of guitar players then, because there weren't a lot of guitar players on the scene that were the ones that you needed to listen to. There's a handful. And of course, if you go back to the Barney Kessels and the Tal Farlows, I got to see Tal Farlow play, also with Joe. And I just tried to absorb the history of that instrument and get as much of it as I could through whatever exposure I could get, records and live,
Well, David, would you be interested in playing another song for the listeners?
Yes, I'd be happy to. I'll play the title track of a record that came out a couple of years ago, which is a solo record. It's called The Lonely Road, and this is the title track of that. So here we go.
Ladies and gentlemen, David Becker. What a cool song.
Oh, thank you. Yeah, that's an interesting tune because The Lonely Road was a record that I did a couple of years ago, and I actually recorded it at Tom Lilly's home studio. Tom was a bass player that had played with the DBT for a while. He's on In Motion, and he's also on a record called Jamaica, which was only released on DVD audio. I think it just came out digitally, though. And Tom had this guitar that was sitting in his studio, and we were just getting ready to record some stuff, and I was just going to do some acoustic stuff. I didn't know what I was actually going to do, but to improvise. And I picked up that guitar that I'd never played before, and the very first thing I played was... And I went, oh, I think I better record this. So I put that down, and then I wrote a little B section to it, and then I put it away. And then I went back and kind of assembled the melody and recorded all that in Minnesota, in Minneapolis. So, and then I had to figure out how I'm going to play it live because it was sort of layered. But with the loop pedal, I've been able to create, this little thing happening. And I played some piano on that on the track. So if you hear the album version, it's similar, but it's a little different. But yet, that version that I recorded, I think, is one I could never duplicate. So this live version has become its own thing. So,
would it be possible for you to put into words what the David Becker sound is?
Oh, that's pretty hard. I guess, musicians that have their own sound, and that's what everybody strives to have, is a reflection of who you are as a person. So I think if you hear me play, you should hopefully hear who I am as a guy and what I have to say, what my little take is on the world of music. Everybody has a little place that they kind of lay their perspective of what this music that we call jazz or improvised music is, and hopefully I've written a little piece of that in my own right. It's hard for me to really know because I'm inside of it, but I do play for the fan that I am. So it's not that I'm trying to impress the guitar players. What I do is I just imagine what I like to hear as a fan, and I try to feed that. And I've been told that, people can hear me play and they recognize it. So that's, I guess I've achieved that level of, personality that comes through. But that's really what it's all about. When you become an improviser, there's 3 stages. There's the first stage, which is kind of you imitate. And imitate doesn't mean you learn to play every John Scofield lick, up and down the neck. You listen to your influences and you try to play what you hear. And then you assimilate, which means you make it your own. And after you can assimilate those ideas, then you can innovate and then start your own path of, whatever that is. And that takes a long time to get to that place. But Joe DiOrio once said to me, he said, you may have had your influences, but you were always David Becker, and that's important. And that meant a lot to me to hear that from him. And that was years later after I had, started playing and making records and stuff. Just because you make records doesn't necessarily mean that you've achieved, the ultimate of what you're going to do, because you keep growing, you keep developing. So that's the good part. There's more in store as you continue to develop your ability to transmit your whatever that sound would be. That makes sense.
So from what you're saying, it sounds like when you're performing or when you're composing a song, you're really thinking about the listener.
Yeah, well, the listener's me. It's less about me trying to, because, you could sit there and say, well, I have to please this audience. And it's like, no. You can never second guess an audience, first of all. What you have to do is you have to be in touch with that listener that you are, the fan. Why did I play music? Because I'm a big fan of music. So obviously I have a huge catalog of stuff, not just the jazz stuff. My oldest brother, Ed, is 6.5 years older. So when he was like 15 or 16, I was, 8 or 9. And he had Jimi Hendrix records, and he bought Led Zeppelin 2 the day it came out. And I was exposed to that at an early age, and I never thought about styles or whatever you want to call it of music. I remember listening to Abbey Road the summer it came out, every day at my neighbor's house, and we bought Monkey records and things like that. So, that was me, the fan. And when I got involved in playing guitar, I still thought of what I liked to hear. So when I was younger and starting to kind of emulate people that I liked, I didn't try to copy them. I just tried to feel like I could do what would appeal to me through the premise of what I could play. And that's just continued on over the years. So at any given time when I'm playing Brad's Blues or The Lonely Road, I might be hearing something totally, unrelated to what people would think musically it is, but it's a sound or a thing that inspired me to make music or that I liked as a fan.
What is it about jazz that fascinates you?
I think it's just that you are dealing with things in real time and you're telling a story. That's the biggest part of it, that, you're able to, because you could play a melody of a tune many different ways, and I think that in itself is a challenge. If I took a standard piece of music like The Days of Wine and Roses or something, there's many ways to approach playing that melody. You listen to Miles Davis. I think Miles Davis, when he played standards, was the epitome of what it's about to be a jazz musician, because his interpretation of just the melody alone was just so brilliant. The way he played, tunes that, like, Someday My Prince Will Come, which is from a Disney movie that you would never think, but he just had that sensibility to be able to do that. He heard melodies, and he was able to communicate that in a very, very direct way. I think that's the thing, too, is when you play, to me, I love all kinds of music, and I'm a big fan of great lyricists, and I love James Taylor and, Bob Dylan and all these people that are very prolific. But I never felt that my voice was something I could write lyrics or that kind of thing to. So I just decided that this is how I could express myself. And that's what I love about jazz, is you could do that. You could take the guitar or your instrument and you can say something in a circumstance, whether it's with a trio, a duo, solo, whatever it is, and make your little statement. And there are many different ways to interpret it. And night after night, it's different. I could play The Lonely Road, in concert night after night, and there's something about it that's a little different each time. And that's the challenge, is that it really puts you in the moment of having to do something. And plus, there's other things. There's the element of listening to what's happening when you're playing with musicians and responding, having a conversation. But you have to remember that I think regardless of what the music is, you have to include the audience as the extra member, meaning that if you're a quartet, that's the fifth member. And their presence is felt by us, and we give back. So there's if I'm playing just to myself, the audience, and I'm in the audience regardless of how big it is, but when there's more people involved, you sense that, you feel that from them, and that gives you something back to give back to them. So it's an interesting process, and I found that in the jazz world, or whatever you want to call that, I felt more comfortable and more at home. I don't know why, but that's just what it was. So,
speaking of the audience, you've had the unique perspective of having a lot of audiences around the world. You've gotten to travel Europe, Japan. Has there been anything that you've learned as a result of playing music around the world?
Yes, music is truly the official language for everybody, and it really transcends any culture. I've done festivals and concerts in Argentina, in New Zealand, in Japan, in Europe, in Russia, all over the States. And one thing that they all have in common is that your music transcends whatever the culture or whatever the language is. And that's kind of cool because, and the other thing too is that, jazz as a musical export is really the cultural export that we've given the rest of the world. But having said that, many musicians from around the globe have added to that and given back. It's kind of like if you look at the blues, was born and raised in this country, but the English guys, like Eric Clapton and the Jeff Becks and the Jimmy Pages, they listened to that blues music when they were kids, and they absorbed it so intensely that they went and made records in the 60s that resonated here to guys that never heard B.B. King or Muddy Waters, and through that, they discovered that. So, there's a nice thing about music. Everybody can add their piece, as I said earlier, and that's what's cool about this thing around the world is that as you go, you pick up things like influences of different cultures come into the music, because obviously a lot of my stuff is as far as the titles are concerned, and some of the inspiration is coming from places that I've been to. And that in itself is great. That's what I really enjoy about being able to do this.
Regardless of genre, you talked about some of the guitarists that have influenced you. What about the composers?
Well, composers, I'd have to say a couple guys. Antonio Carlos Jobim is a Brazilian composer who's brilliant and wrote some amazing, he was the father of the bossa nova, and wrote some amazing pieces of music which are still in awe about, and they're very, very complicated to play. I've recorded a couple. Henry Mancini is a composer that I really like because not only, with the Days of Wine and Roses, but, the Pink Panther and all the things he did for film. Paul McCartney, John Lennon, those guys too are great composers. In the jazz world of the contemporary guys, Chick Corea and Joe Zawinul and Wayne Shorter. I'd have to also put Herbie Hancock in there. Of course, Mancini and Lyle Mays are guys that I look up to. But one of the guys that is probably the biggest influence on me compositionally is bassist Eberhard Weber from Germany. And Eberhard's music was a big influence on, I know, Lyle Mays, because I've talked to, and Pat as well. Pat got to play with him, but I know Lyle was a huge fan. And I just love the way Eberhard composed. And Eberhard did something that was cool because he actually was combining classical elements with improvisation. And I really, really resonated with me. And probably if you listen to the Batavia record, you'll hear a lot of the Eberhard influence in there. But there's a tune on my very first record that was influenced by him. It's called Pictures of the Past. So, that's a guy that I could listen to all day. And I think, and then of course, Ralph Towner is a great composer too. And you could go through the list of guys that, wrote tunes over the years in the jazz genre. But that's, and then of course Bach and Mozart and people like that. Because my parents listened to classical music. My brother played classical piano as a kid. So we were absorbed by, all these different kinds of things. Edvard Grieg, the very first piece of music I vividly remember listening to from start to finish was his piano concerto in A minor. I used to stand in front of the thing with a little tinker toy and conduct, So, and that resonated with me as well still today, that piece had a big influence on me, so.
Would there be anything that you listen to, not necessarily an influence, but maybe a band or an artist that we would be surprised to know?
I think, I'm a big fan of the Scorpions, and I'll tell you why, because when we went over to Europe in the early 80s to do our very first DBT tour, and we played all these clubs, we had a little EP with Warner Brothers, and, we kind of got our feet wet. We had a Volkswagen van that had a cassette player that my brother bought, like a little boom box. And the only cassette that he could find in a record store was Love at First Sting, which was the Scorpions record. And he just happened to hear something on MTV, and he said, I have this Scorpions tune. So we just listened to that up and down, and, I loved listening to those guys. I'm a big fan of Bad Company, too, because I heard that as a kid, and Led Zeppelin, of course. But, yeah, I guess people would be surprised to hear that I listened to the Scorpions. Not on a regular basis, but, yeah, that's one of the bands that I enjoyed listening to.
Well, David, how would you feel about playing another of your songs?
Sure. I'd like to do one this is kind of an unusual piece of music. This is one from The Lonely Road, which kind of incorporates some of the things I was talking about, these different elements of music, and it's called Seat 3A.
All right. Very interesting song.
Thank you. Yeah, it's evolved over the years. It started off as just an improvised piece that I'd done at a Joe DiOrio clinic. And when it came time to do the record, I started to just think about an arrangement, and it's evolved since then. So it's a fun piece to play because it's always different, but yet it has a similar theme. So
It started out, it almost sounded like samba or something.
well, yeah, I'm using some of what the guitar can do. This guitar, this is a David Becker signature model from Heritage. This is actually the prototype from 30 years ago. We call it the Million Miler because I think we've logged about 1.5 million miles of flying. And I can get different percussive sounds with it, and that is kind of nice to utilize that as sort of a percussion instrument and then see what happens. And then I can put the little piece of paper in there and get sort of a sitar sound. And it's a very versatile instrument, so...
How do you define good music? What makes music good?
Well, I'd have to paraphrase what George Benson said. If it sounds good and it feels good, it's good. So, I mean, that's a an easy thing to say, but I mean, really, if the musicians have something to say, if it has a good sound to it and a good feel is so important. I mean, musical feel is something that, either you've got it or you don't, and you have to really develop that because every kind of music that has resonated with people, regardless whether it's Brazilian or R&B, blues, whatever you want to call it, there's something about the rhythm that really pulsates and pulls people in, and that's a very integral part of all music. And music is dialectic, meaning like languages. So each of those musical forms has a dialect, which is inherent in that music. And if you go back to the tradition of the African rhythms that came to this country, they spread out into all musics like jazz, blues, Cuban music, music from the Caribbean, music from South America. And that inherent feel that came from Africa is there. It's an underlining feel. And if you understand that and you're able to tap into that, it'll help you to develop a nice feel for your music. So that's kind of where I look at what I think defines good music. And it doesn't matter stylistically what people call it or, what the instrumentation is. If somebody has something to say and they're able to present it in a very cohesive way, that's cool.
I would be curious to know what you think about the early American jazz, like going back to what they call now the American Songbook.
Well, it's a very important part of the tradition of jazz because, if you go back to the 20s and to that period of time, they were writing show tunes, and you had people like Jerome Kern and Victor Young, these composers, and of course the Gershwins, who were writing these incredible pieces of music. They were show tunes or they were in movies, and they weren't just popular because they were popular. They were popular because they were good pieces of music. They still stand the test of time. But I talked about dialects. So if you go back to the early part of that writing period, when swing and ragtime started to develop, there was a certain amount of vogue to have dominant 7 chords, which means that you'd have these kind of cadences. So you'd have things like... And of course, you had songs like I Got Rhythm, which has become a jazz standard with rhythm changes. But, the dialect of the day was they had certain voicings and certain kinds of sounds of chords that were very in vogue. And that set the tone for the guys to come after that who did the bebop stuff, who took those pieces of music and said, well, instead of playing that dominant 7 like that, what if we put a flat 9 in there and make it sound like this? Give it a little like what Bach did, give it some color, some other kind of color. And that changed the whole face. I mean, today it's very common for us to hear things like that, but back then it was very unusual for the instrumentalists to play that and to hear those kinds of chords because it wasn't really something they were used to hearing. But it became, then it evolved into the stuff that was after the bebop stuff, which was the 50s and 60s, whatever you want to call that, cool jazz or whatever. and the monks and people like that, Thelonious Monk, and how they developed their harmonic sense. But it really all goes back to Bach. It's like Bach is the guy, or that period of writing and harmonic understanding that's still a tradition today. And you can hear it in all kinds of music. He improvised, and I guess I read somewhere that his wife was the transcriber. She used to transcribe the things he would play, and he was improvising, but then it was written down. So there was a sense of like what jazz musicians do. You play something, and then you kind of write it down, or you play it and remember it. And those harmonies still transcend. But I mean, the Great American Songbook is so important because that set the tone for what became jazz. And without that, we never would have had what we have today. So that's a very important part of the development of the music.
Do you have any dream project?
Well, I have a project coming up, actually, the record Batavia, which it came out now back in 2010. That's a record that I wrote music about my mother's family story. My mother is Dutch Indonesian, and she was in a Japanese prison camp for 4 years in what's now Jakarta, but then it was Batavia. And her father, or stepfather, her brother, her mother, and herself. And next year is the 75th anniversary of their release. So I'm getting together with the Metropole Orchestra from the Netherlands, and we're going to do a concert of that music. And we'll do it with the 50-piece orchestra, playing all the tunes from Batavia from start to finish as a memorial or as a nod to them. And out of this project, we're going to... some of the proceeds we're going to put towards a music scholarship fund, which we're going to give a young student the opportunity to study with me and the Metropole Orchestra. And because I was just in Japan, and in Japan that story is not really known because they didn't really teach that much in their history, I'd like to pick a Japanese student to come because I think that's a diplomatic way to utilize this opportunity of this horrific historical thing to bring something very positive out of it, a musical scholarship for somebody who will be able to carry on the legacy of music, because I mean music is very important, and I'm not a politician, I'm a musician, so that was the best way for me to do it. It's also to honor people like my mother that went through this horrific thing, and the Metropole Orchestra is an amazing group that has been around since 75 years. Next year they play with everybody, with Sting. They just did something with Snarky Puppy. Mancini did some stuff with them, and a whole bunch of people, if you look at their legacy. But they're very, very nice people, and they were very ecstatic about doing this with me. So I'll update you on when the concert's happening. It's probably August or September of next year. I'll be seeing them in a couple of weeks when I'm overseas to kind of hopefully get the venue sorted out. And we'll release that concert of a live performance, as well as probably a live either DVD or a video or something like that as well.
How exciting.
Yeah.
Very cool.
Yeah.
What is the best thing about being David Becker?
Oh, I guess the best thing about my life is that I get a chance to go to all these different places. I'm very grateful for the fact that I get to do this. I mean, I was lucky that I traveled the world as a child. My father worked for the airlines, and my mother was European, so we would go travel to Europe every year. From the time I was 2 until I was about 10, I'd cross the Atlantic 18 times, and we'd go for a month and visit my grandfather and my relatives, and my dad liked Austria, and we would drive around. We would usually go during the spring or the fall because it was easier to get seats because there was space available. And we'd go for 1 month, and they would take us out of school, and I never realized how much of an impact that had on me. But it was a huge impact on becoming a musician, because I knew right away when I was going to be a musician, I was going to travel. I tell my students, if you want to play music for a living, get a passport, because you're going to need to go and travel. And I don't take it for granted. I've been doing this now for 35 years, and I'm so grateful for every opportunity I get to go anywhere I go and really try to be in the moment of, people say, oh, the concerts are great and all this stuff. It's like, no, for me, every moment of what I get to do, whether I get to sit and talk to you or I get to sit down with an old friend and have coffee, it's the same as if I'm performing for 1,000 people. I don't differentiate it. It's just me being me and what I do in my life. And I'm very, very fortunate to be able to do this. And as I said, I don't take it for granted. So
I always like to end the interview by just giving the artist the stage. We just never know who's listening, and as you know, especially jazz being such an international thing, we don't know who's listening, where, when. What would you say to anyone who's tuned in?
Well, I would say it's the most important thing is music is a very integral part of every society on our planet, and it is the one thing that really connects us all. And if you're in touch with that, whether you're a listener as a fan, or you play a little bit, or you play a lot, I think it's important to realize the significance and the beauty of what music is and what it has to offer. And if you want to just learn to play an instrument just to play a little bit at your house, that's fine, because your perspective will change once you start to play an instrument. I think it opens up part of our brain that we don't normally use, but everybody's kind of connected to that because there's an internal heartbeat of the earth, how it spins, and that's something everybody feels when you get 60,000 people clapping on 2 and 4 for We Will Rock You, and probably half are not musical. Get aware of that. Be aware of that. That's such a big part of all the cultures, and that we have the opportunity today to really explore the music that preceded our generation in a way where we didn't have that opportunity years ago. There were recordings, but now you can just hit a button on the internet and you can go through someone's catalog within seconds, and you can explore all these things, see television shows of performances of people that you wouldn't have seen normally because that wasn't available back then. So take advantage of the technology, but understand the significance of music and how important it is to our well-being.
Now, David, you've been very, very generous. First of all, agreeing to do this interview, coming out here, playing for us. It's been a great pleasure.
Well, it's been a pleasure for me. I enjoy the opportunity to do this. So.
But I have to ask one thing.
Sure.
I always like to end on a kind of sentimental note.
Okay.
Sometimes a little melancholy. Could you think of a song maybe that you could send the viewers and the listeners on their way with?
Sure. Yeah, let me...
Beautiful. Thank you.
You're very welcome.
Doodly zing bang booya ducky japadoona cockaboodly ka sabiti banka chila baka do zilla bonka total luck upon goodbye.